maybe not even in smaller communities, because I know if I talk to my one friend at Chapala, he would say very blatantly, if you do that to my child, me and my brothers and my cousins are coming for you, and we will enact justice, because they don't trust the system that it will provide justice. Romans 13:4, when talking about the role of the governing authority, says that they are a servant of God, sent for the very purpose of punishing those who do what is wrong. That was God's intention. That is God's desire, right? But when the governing authority is anti-Christ, rejects God's authority, when it no longer serves good people, right? Or maybe there's just no authority for justice. There's nothing in place to provide justice. Someone has to step in to stop evil, right? Someone has to. Interesting, Romans 12:9, there is one thing, only one thing in the Bible that the Lord calls us to hate. He says, let your love be genuine, abhor or hate is another translation, what is evil, hold fast to what is good. So he's saying, out of all the things in the world, there's a place for hate. There's a place for being righteously angry. And so we are called, along with him, to hate what is evil. Evil in all its forms and manifestations should cause us to be upset, should be angry, should cause us to stand up and to do something. Perhaps you remember the saying, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. This is attributed to Edmund Burke. Some say no, but Edmund Burke from the 1700s, an Irishman, Northern Irish, working in Great Britain and talking about the situation in the governments at that time. Now, it doesn't mean we resort to violence, right? But it means that we take whatever action we can, right? Whatever action we can to prevent evil from spreading. And in fact, when you think about it, along with Christ, when we're in Christ, as part of his kingdom, one of our roles is to stand up against evil, to fight against evil. So now, I would say a pacifist would say, no, it's not up to us to seek justice, right? This is the Lord's domain. He will provide justice in the end. So we leave it in God's hands. You know what? If you do nothing, when an evil person continues to harm children over and over again, and you let them harm multiple children, how does that honor God? How is that right? I can't see that that's what God desires. That's what he wants. So part of a believer's responsibility, especially parents, and it's not just believers, all parents, but godly parents, is to protect their children from harm, right? That's your role. That's one of your main roles, keeping them even just from running out on the street, keeping them in whatever way. You think about, we see here in Mexico, kids playing outside at night and relatively safely, right? And we grew up like that, most of us. Our parents didn't even know where we were half the time, and they weren't too concerned about it. But I know not parents now in the States and Canada who don't even want them, for sure not in the front yard, right? Like they're so concerned about predators and about different harms that could come to their kids. If you look at this story, the actions of both these fathers in this passage, well, they're not really actions at all. It's silence, or it's failure to discipline, okay? So Hamor is the king, the father of Shechem. And he never criticized or disciplined his son. Instead, he's like, okay, I'll help you get what you want. No, you're right. You deserve her. I'm going to help you get her, right? I'll go on your behalf. And so he supports and tries to help his son, get Dinah as his wife. And the problem is Jacob, he says he's going to wait till his sons come back before he does anything, but you don't hear him doing anything, right? He doesn't say really anything. In chapter 34, verse 5, so it says, soon Jacob heard that Shechem had defiled his daughter Dinah, but since his sons were out in the fields, herding his livestock. He said nothing until they returned. Well, in the passage, he continues to say nothing. There's no response, right? But he did not confront Hamor or Shechem. He did not demand justice. He did not display outrage that a parent should. You had thought that he would got in these boys' faces and had it out, right? Like, seriously. Was he scared? Because he's in a foreign land and this is a king and a prince and he's just going to let it go? Is this the classic story of, well, I'm sorry, my daughter, but just keep your mouth shut and this will all pass, which has happened far too often in the world and in church society, way too often, too much. You know, it's the brothers of Dinah who we are told are shocked and outraged, as brothers should be, who are protecting their little sister, right? They're shocked and outraged about what happened. And I'm sure Jacob was outraged, but think if he would have taken the lead in condemning Shechem, in going after his father, demanding justice, perhaps his sons wouldn't have deceived this entire tribe of men, caused them to get, it says, circumcised, and then 3 days later, when they're in a weakened state, go and kill them all, take all their life, women and children and livestock and all their riches and take them for themselves, which really wasn't a great thing. I mean, talk about overkill, right? It's a very definition of the word overkill. So we know we struggle with that in the Old Testament, right? Like, but nowhere does it say that God was good with this, right? It's not necessarily God is saying that this is right and good. I think they figured if their dad wasn't going to deal with the situation, that they would, right? Dad's not going to deal with this. We'll take care of it. We'll take care of it. And I think they were probably right in believing that if they only punished Shechem, that it was going to come back on him, right? That his tribe, you kill the prince, well, the whole tribe's going to come after you, right? And it's going to be a war. You know, the brothers of Dinah, they sought justice for this outrageous act, and then they made that justice happen. I think the problem is they killed a great many innocents in the process, people who had no part of this other than being part of that tribe or that society. And then afterwards, even Jacob says, now you made us a stink in this place, and they're going to all come after us, right? They're all going to be our enemies. But we see this kind of eye for an eye justice in the Old Testament, right? I mean, this is not unusual. And later, even in the law that the Lord passed down to Moses, we see this same kind of very harsh kind of tit for tat justice being laid out. And even in the New Testament narrative, I mean, really, you see the same form of justice was still in place amongst the Israelites. It really was. I mean, they stoned people to death who broke the laws, and they did that in the name of the Lord, right? Jesus himself faced the wrath of the religious leaders who almost stoned him to death more than on one occasion. But because he was God, it says in one place that basically he was pushed up to the end of the cliff and they were ready to stone him to death. And then he was gone. He removed himself from the situation. And that happened in other times as well. Of course, he was ultimately crucified for what they said was blasphemy, right? In the eyes of the religious elite, he was a blasphemer because he said that he was God. But it would only be blasphemy if it wasn't true, right? But it was, of course. But Jesus' teaching inaugurated a new way. Not that there was no justice in this life, because I think it's true that he believed in these principles that had been ordained by God, that governing authorities were set in place to be the justice system, to be the police, to protect innocent, good people. And so essentially the laws of the Romans and the Jews were doing that. They're there to keep the peace. But Jesus did remind us that ultimately all people would face the Lord, would face judgment and receive justice, or face justice. So does that mean we just allow privileged and evil people to harm our children. Is the Lord pleased when children are indoctrinated with what amounts to mental rape? I just heard that phrase a few days ago, and I think it's completely apropos with what's happening to our children. They're going to face massive trauma for the rest of their life for what these little minds are being exposed to and taught. And the answer is obviously no. The Lord is not pleased. He's not wanting any of this. I believe he's outraged by the harm that millions of children are coming to. And of course, this movie, Freedom, that has come out is making this more apparent, right? Making this, all of us more aware how bad it really is, which is far beyond what any of us, I think, can comprehend, because we only know a little bit of what's happening every day. You know, in Canada, it's Muslim fathers and mothers right now who are standing in the streets in huge groups, having rallies, condemning the government and the school boards, and coming out, who are very much so. And you can find this material, not just in Canada, it's throughout the world, actually. We just saw a thing about the island of Malta, and the same issues there, different, but very similar, that there's pornographic and sexually explicit material in their libraries, and that teachers are promoting this alternative lifestyle in a really profound and provocative way. The Muslims are trying to protect their children, right, from an evil world system that seeks to destroy the truth of how their children are made in God's image, to oppose the state, which they say, and they're absolutely right, and we agree, has no right to indoctrinate our children, right? Has no right. So where are the Christian parents? Are they speaking out? Well, they are, and they have been somewhat. But if you do that in Canada, you have no rights or freedoms because you're not a Muslim. You see, Muslims and other minority groups are protected. They can pretty much say whatever they want, and they're not criticized, they're not jailed, they're not, and we see it especially with Muslim groups throughout the world, right? That there's been a ton of problems, but somehow we're tippy-toeing around them, and we're if you're a fringe or a minority group, as it's called, you have rights, right? And they're greatly expressed and really protected. So when Christians do speak out about these same issues in the same ways, they're called haters, right? They're persecuted, and they are sometimes thrown in jail. In fact, I don't know if you know the pastor Arthur Pawlowski. He's the one that through COVID was thrown in jail multiple times because he wouldn't close his church down. But more than that, he was even received fines in jail because he went out to the street when you weren't supposed to go outside and fed the homeless. And so he was persecuted for that, amongst many other things. He has, I can't remember, 200 and some offenses laid up against him, 130, I don't know. It's crazy. He's right now in his house under house arrest, and he faces 10 years of imprisonment. So, and in the meantime, they mentioned a few, it was interesting on the article I was reading, they mentioned a few people who were accused of terrorism have been let out of jail twice already, reoffended, and let out again. But you know what? This shouldn't stop the church. This should not stop us as followers of Christ. We don't have to resort to violence, but we should stand against evil to protect our children. We really must, because no one else will. God hates evil, and he calls on us to hate what is evil. And so behind all this worldly decay and this immorality is our enemy, is Satan, right? The one who seeks to destroy all that is good and from the Lord. And he's using ungodly, privileged people to harm children in the name of freedom and love. Isn't that interesting? We're going to harm your children in the name of freedom and love. So we know this. Satan is an expert of manipulating and twisting the word of God and even these holy attributes such as freedom and love. And he does this to deceive those who don't know him. And more, This is terrible. I mean, it's just who he, this is it. He is evil, right? And so he delights in harming children. Who delights in harming children? Only those who are, we're told not to hate the flesh and blood. But it is really hard not to be upset with someone who does these things, right? Destroys anything made in God's image. So by doing this, by what's happening in the world, and we see it, I guess, more blatantly now, I feel we do, that the moral paradigm of the world is changing, right? There's a shift in that. And it means that there's generations who are losing sight of what it means to be made in God's image. It started a while ago. It's not new, right? Me and Bill were talking about, what do you think? Like in the 50s already, this program began in academia and in different places. You know, the moral compass that mankind has used for centuries is rapidly disappearing. We don't know what's north anymore and what's south. We are being desensitized to sin. And more, God does not receive the glory for what's good and for what's right. And it's not just out in the world, it's the church too. And it makes me so sad because the church is accepting what is also considered sin. I mean, what has been considered sin for what? Since the beginning of the church is now being downplayed, and it's just, and they're be justifying sin in the name of love. So, you know, the goal or the desire of Satan always was that he would be glorified and not God, right? That he would be the one that would receive the glory, that he would take the place of God. And he seems in many ways to be getting his wish, right? The church is supposed to be the voice of God in the wilderness, the voice of God in the world. And it's time for us, all of us, to stand up against the evil schemes of the devil. So, especially when it comes to our children. I don't believe the Lord's going to be pleased with churches or individuals who proclaim to be his followers, but do nothing because they're too scared, because they're worried about persecution or whatever else might come. If we're more concerned about our comfort, about peace, keeping the peace and not making waves about whatever it is, while we know that children are being harmed daily, this is not Christ-like. It's not following him. You can't tell me that if Jesus was standing there and someone was harming a child, he would do nothing. We know what he did with the money changers and the whips. How much more so would he do if he saw the harm being done to a child? Now, we will likely be ridiculed for standing against evil. We'll have to possibly pay a great price for speaking the truth in love. That's part of it, right? We may even be persecuted or jailed for daring to speak up against the privileged princes, like the Shechems of the world. You know, this thing we just watched from this homosexual who came to faith and was talking about that. He is being facing jail time for dare to proclaim Christ and his transition back to God and away from homosexuality, only because he is speaking about that out loud and trying to help other people understand. He's under persecution of jail time in Malta for proclaiming Christ, because they say he's trying to convince other homosexuals that they shouldn't be that. Right. So it's okay for them to pressure and convince people and to say whatever they want, but it's not okay to proclaim Christ and transition away from that, only transition to it. You know, Jacob's sons, I think, were outraged for a really good reason. Absolutely. Their young sister was harmed grievously, and there was no remorse by the perpetrator, right? There's no remorse there. Shechem just wanted to throw money at them so that they would just forsake their principles and give their sister to him, right? They thought he could buy his way out. And then he tried to convince them that he loved Dinah. I care for her so much. I love her. Love usually doesn't begin with rape. I'm just saying. Now, admittedly, the boys could have maybe handled it better, right? Not so sure. Part of me says good on them, right? At least with Shechem anyway. But maybe I don't think they saw it that way. I think there was no justice in that place for their sister. After all, they're up against the king and the prince. This is who they've got their issue with. Who's going to listen to them? Where's the justice? They're really they're in a foreign land. I don't know if they could have gone to Esau and they could have done, but it would have been a war, right? And lots of people would have died. But they also, think of this, even though Jacob didn't say anything, Jacob obviously raised them to have a profound sense of justice and to care for their family and to watch out for each other. You know, I think throughout most, if not all, the world, the governing authorities is Antichrist. They're no longer governments who are under God, right, for the glory of God. They're governments who have pushed God away and want nothing to do with God or the things of God. So you can't rely on them to protect your children, obviously, because they're the ones who are allowing or even promoting the policies that we see, not just in the school system, but the healthcare system throughout, that are tantamount to mental rape of these children. I think Satan seeks to cause our children to be completely confused about who they are, right? To be in complete confusion about that, and to be desensitized to the concept of right and wrong. Because if you can create that atmosphere, this complete confusion about what's a man and what's a woman, complete confusion about right and wrong, about morality, well, there is no such, it's Buddhism has that at its core, that there isn't really, there is, right? But they see everything on a scale, like a balanced scale. Cold and hot, good and evil, etc., etc. All of these things are necessary in the world. They explain the world. That's why you have the yin and yang symbol, right? These two coexisting things. And so there really isn't sin, there's just good and bad. And I think that's the way the world now is kind of promoting things. It's not sin, because there is no God. And you can kind of do whatever you want, and it's okay. Better if you don't hurt somebody, but you just do whatever you want. So this whole desensitization to the concept of morality and to God and sin, if it keeps going in this way, and if a few generations, the whole concept of a holy God and being made precious in the image of God is going to be gone. Destroy the understanding of being made in God's image, destroy the moral compass of God's word as truth, destroy the knowledge that Jesus Christ is a savior who forgives our sin, and the world is lost, right? And that is the goal of Satan. It's what just is described in Matthew 24, verses 9 to 13 by Jesus, when he says, you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. Jesus then goes on farther in 24, verses 37 to talk about Noah, and he says that we are in the days of Noah. Well, he doesn't say that. He says, but we will be. Now, you might say that. I'm not sure where we're at in that timeline, but it's a time of great depravity, a time of great rejection of God. You think about the Lord destroying Sodom and Gomorrah because of such depravity. It's a story in Abraham. So possibly even Isaac, I can't remember. No, Isaac wasn't born then. It was before Isaac's time, right? And the Lord came and wiped out his angels, wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah because of the depravity, the great evil, wickedness that was in the world, in those cities especially. And it will be like that, he says, again, before his return, before he comes back. I'm not sure that in history that there's ever been a time when our children have been exposed to such explicit and downright pornographic material than ever before at such a young age in the school systems, and they're telling us this is good and right. I don't get it. I can't understand it. I just can't. They're defending it and saying no, and the teachers are defending it. Obviously, there's a great many people in the world who have no concept of a moral compass of what's good and right anymore. If this is destructive, that imagery to an adult's mind, what's it doing to a child's mind? What is that doing, right? And that's why I call it mental rape. I agree with that statement. It's something that will cause them harm the rest of their life. They're destroying the purity of children from a young age and trying to convince us it's good and beneficial. Shechem thought because of his wealth and power, he could do what he wanted, even abuse a daughter of Israel. He was wrong, and justice was served. Harshly, but served. And around the world, people of privilege, people in positions of authority, are also believing they can do whatever they want to do with our children. Did you see the march just a while ago? And they were chanting, and part of the slogan was, "And we're coming for your children." Seriously? It's a Satan on one banner, and "we're coming for your children" on another. They're not hiding it even, right? It's in plain sight. Feeding our children these depraved notions, right? In schools, and think of the children's movies, Disney. Give me a break. I grew up on Disney. We would sit on Sunday evening and have BLT sandwiches. That was a thing. Mom would make great toasted BLT sandwiches, and we would sit down at 6 p.m. on the 2 or 3 channels we had on the farm, and we would watch Disney. And it was wholesome. Herbie the Love Bug, right? Or whatever else it might have been. These you know, what's happened? What has happened? So you've got that. You have movies, you have the internet, the social media, and then telling us that we have to say it's good and right under the law, right? Our enemy, the devil, is desensitizing us to sin, right? To depravity, to injustice, so that we don't really, well, it's not that important. And he's using, he says, that the spiritual forces to rule over these governing authorities and other powers in the world. And so these laws that are being put in place to promote love and peace and all of that are really a counterfeit, right, to what God really had put into place. It's a counterfeit. Their role is to erode and ultimately destroy the very concept of God among us. And that's why I say, you know, you think of John the Baptist, a voice crying out in the wilderness. And maybe that's exactly what the Lord desires from us now, to be a voice calling out in the wilderness in a place where no one knows him. Jacob's sons were pretty drastic, right, in dealing with the harm done to their sister. They were quite drastic. And I think a lot of us men nod our heads, right? Go, yeah, I get it. Jacob was rather silent through the whole thing. You know, there's a problem here, because if Jacob would have taken charge right away, maybe justice may be attained in another way, possibly, right? It could have happened. Think of, okay, when you think of Homer, the king, Shechem's dad, if he would have taken action with his son and said, "This is not right. You don't do these things. This is not how we treat another people who want to live amongst us. What are you doing? We need to make this right." Think about David, another king, and Tamar, and too many sons from too many wives in that mix too, right? And Tamar being raped by her half brother, and then her true brother, because David did not do anything. He did not address, he was upset, but he didn't address the situation. He didn't find justice. And so Tamar's brother killed his half-brother. And then what happened after that? It became an absolute mess in the kingdom. And he rose up against his own father because fathers did not step up, whether it was out of fear, whatever the reason. You know, if we remain silent as silent as parents, as Christ followers, as brothers and sisters, I guarantee you the harm to our children will grow even greater. We cannot be silent, especially out of fear, for whatever reason we'd have that fear. Proverbs 22:6 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. If we allow others, ungodly people, to train up our children with the agendas that they want, more often than not, they're going to forsake God when they grow up, right? They're going to be so harmed, so their minds are going to be so affected by this deception that that's what they're going to believe. And that's what they're going to promote, which has happened already throughout the generations as we see it. That's why there's such a move, and we see it all the time, of people in the systems yelling, screaming out, get your children out of the school system. Get them out while you can. Man, it was bad. Maybe when we were there, it wasn't that bad, right? We had to struggle with different social things and all of that, but not this kind of depravity being taught from the top down. We see the result and progression, right, of this reality in our world over time and how it's getting worse and worse. And so God is calling us to stand up against evil in this present world where knowledge of him and respect of him and his ways are dwindling. He's telling us to put on the armor of God and to stand firm. He's telling us, along with him, to hate what is evil.